We were introduced to the prophets very early in this series of studies. By definition, a prophet is one who speaks for God. In practice, if God spoke to a person, whether audibly or through visions, angels, or dreams, then that person served as a mouthpiece for God to speak to others. They are called by this term prophet. Usually, when we think of the books of prophecy, however, we think less of what qualifies that person as a prophet and more about what he wrote. We tend to think of prophets as people who foretold the future, writers such as Isaiah, Daniel, and Zechariah. This is a little misleading about the nature of prophecy. As you read through the books of Kings and the books of prophecy, you'll see that these prophets usually led very difficult lives. Their job was to bring messages from God, primarily to nations, kings, and military leaders. The messages were often unpopular as they foretold the destruction, often of the king and nation to whom they spoke. The ways the prophets demonstrated the word of God was often self-destructive, difficult, and humiliating. Hosea was commanded to marry a prostitute whom he would have to rescue from the house of another lover so that he would adequately represent God's jealousy towards Israel. Ezekiel was told to lie on his left side for 390 days and bear the sins of Israel, 1 day for each year of their punishment. Then he was told to lie on his right side for 40 days. When Jeremiah prophesied of the ruin of Jerusalem, King Zedekiah put him in prison, and then some of the king's officials threw him into a muddy pit so that he sank down into the mud until he was rescued by one of the king's servants. Elijah prophesied against Ahab and against the prophets of the pagan god Baal. Ahab and Jezebel, his wife, sought to have him killed, so he went into hiding in the wilderness in fear. These are just a few of the parables faced by prophets of God to illustrate that prophecy is more than just foretelling the future. It's conveying the message of God in the most effective way possible under whatever circumstances and through whatever difficulties might arise. The books of prophecy may be difficult reading for a variety of reasons. It may or may not be obvious when or under what circumstances the book was written. For example, it is not known with certainty when the book of Joel was written. Some assign a 9th century date and others an 8th century date, BC. So then your beliefs about what is being discussed may differ depending on when you think it was written, or vice versa. The prophets often foretold future events in history. Some of that history has been lost to us, so it's hard to know what historical events are being talked about. Daniel spoke in such detail and with such accuracy of events that were to have taken place that many scholars cannot believe it was written prior to those events. Prophets often use figurative language that would have been more accessible to someone who understood the culture and socio-political background of the writing. That puts some of the writing out of reach for us because we can't go back in time to know the cultural references. Some prophecies forecast events that would happen far in the future, and just how far is not clear. This opens up the writing to different schools of interpretation. Some have more than one application in history. Often the prophet will speak of an immediate application of what he says, but later another prophet will apply those same words in another historical context. For example, Isaiah said that a maiden would bring forth a son whose name would be Emmanuel. It is clear in context that the event was to happen in the near future. However, the same words were spoken to Joseph as a sign of the Messiah before the birth of Jesus in Matthew chapter 1, verse 23. The angel there implies that there would be a second fulfillment of those prophetic words, and of course, the second fulfillment was greater than the first. For now, let me recommend that you, on your first reading, simply read the prophecies to understand what you can within the historical context in which they were written. Use a trusted Bible encyclopedia or other reference to know when and under what circumstances it was written and the purpose of the writing. You'll come across visions and analogies that you don't understand. That's okay. Just let your senses absorb the imagery and understand the parts that the writer explains. The books that will most challenge you will include Isaiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, after chapter 7, and Zechariah. I'm not suggesting that you avoid these books. There are some real gems in there. I'm only recommending that you not become discouraged if they defy your ability to understand them. But especially avoid over-interpreting what you read It's hard to learn when you have preconceived ideas. The following will help you know very roughly at what place in the text to insert the prophets in the storyline of the Old Testament. They're divided according to where they occur in the history of the nation, whether before or after the destruction of the two capital cities. The first concentration of these books of prophecy were focused on the kings of Israel and the pagan nations surrounding them soon before the northern kingdom fell to the army of Assyria. Israel's capital city of Samaria was destroyed, and they were led away by a brutal Assyrian army under King Sennacherib in 721 BC. So all the following were written before this date: Obadiah, Joel, Jonah, Hosea, Amos, Isaiah, Micah. The second concentration of the prophets were focused on the kings of Judah. These prophets encouraged the leadership of Judah to return to the Lord from their false gods, and when they refused, told them of their impending destruction. They also pronounced doom on the nations that have harassed God's people throughout the generations. Some 130 years after their sister nation had fallen to Assyria, Judah would fall, and Jerusalem would be utterly destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar of the Neo-Babylonian Empire in 589 BC. Before that happened, here are the written prophecies. Before the fall of Judah: Jeremiah, Lamentations, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah. This is the point that we have reached in our studies so far. So if you're reading the Bible along with this series, these are the prophets you would read while going through the books of Kings and Chronicles. During the Babylonian exile of Judah, there were two prominent writers. During Babylonian exile: Ezekiel, Daniel. In fact, the book of Daniel is written partially in the Chaldean language, indicating Babylonian influence on the book's author. The fourth and final concentration of prophets came after the Babylonian exile. We'll talk about these books in future lessons. Writings after the exile: Ezra, Nehemiah, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi. During the times of the divided kingdom, God held dialogue with the kings of Israel and Judah through the mouths of his prophets. For example, Isaiah foretold the destruction of Israel, and Jeremiah would prophesy up to the destruction of Judah and Jerusalem. The reason for the destruction? Spiritual adultery. God had formed this nation out of one faithful man, Abraham, and promised to bless the world through him. He had led them, disciplined them, and preserved them. And now they have left him for gods who are not even gods. So great was his jealousy that the Lord was now willing to let the nation suffer at the hand of other pagan nations whose gods they were now trusting in. They now had more in common with those nations than they did with Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, or David, all of whom trusted in the one true and living God. There's far too much information to even provide a proper summary of all these many different prophets in this short series of lessons. I'll leave these to your reading. As you read over the course of a lifetime, you'll grow to understand them more completely. Messianic Prophecies. It would be an oversight on my part if we did not spend at least a few minutes talking about one of the key features of the prophets. Most of the prophets at some point in their writings spoke of a time when Israel would be regathered under the leadership of a great king who is coming to reign on the throne of David, a king of great might who would bring peace to the new Israel. This kingdom was to grow to fill the entire earth, to encompass all peoples and last forever. Other kingdoms would rise and fall and even be crushed under the weight of this new kingdom. Who would be this great anointed ruler of peace? The Jews wanted to know, but the answer was out of their reach. All the prophets writing during all the different time periods could hardly finish a book without saying something about this puzzling figure. And yet, before any appearance of such a one, both Israel and Judah have now been seemingly lost. Has God rejected them forever? Did he default on his promises because of their unfaithfulness? Or did God still have something more, something that seemed impossible, in store for these people? Remember what we learned from the birth of Isaac. With God, anything is possible. Won't you join us next time as we follow Israel into Babylon to see what will become of them there? Thank you for being with us today.